Welcome everybody to our Florida Land Steward webinar. Is it time to thin your pine stand? For those that don't know me, my name is Chris Demers. I'm an Extension Program Manager here at the University of Florida IFAS School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences. I run our Florida Land Steward Extension Program. I'm joined today by Mr. Ian Stone. He's a registered forester and forestry extension agent out in the Panhandle. He's based over in Walton County, Florida, out there in West Florida, and he is the extension forestry agent serving that region of the state. So we really appreciate him being with us today, and he's going to be giving most of the presentation today as we get started. As most of you know, or not familiar, thinning is an intermediate rotation treatment in forestry, particularly in even-aged management situations, which we do with southern pines. And it's basically an opportunity to go in and manage the density of your forest stands. Forest stands, as they're planting, will often become more and more dense as the trees get bigger, and basal area will increase. So it's advantageous to go in there and adjust that density so that we're managing the timber crop to grow into larger products and larger forest products, which means higher value in most cases. Depending on the markets and your management objectives, thinning might be something that you might be considering at some point during the rotation of your stand. And you may be considering that now, and hopefully this webinar will give you some guidance on how to go about that and how to determine if it's time to thin your forest stand. Before we get through, I'm going to ask Ian to advance my slide here. I want to encourage everybody to participate in the webinar today, and you'll have opportunities to ask questions as we go. We're going to handle questions at the end of the presentation, but as you think of questions, you can go ahead and use that Q&A button that's on your Teams interface there. You'll see a chat button up there, and you also see a Q&A right next to that. Use the Q&A to ask your questions, and we will handle those at the end of the presentations. But as you think of questions, go ahead and use that Q&A. Next slide, Ian. The materials, including this presentation for this webinar, are located on our website. And those are at that link that's at the bottom of that page. We're also going to be asking you to fill out a very short evaluation to give us some feedback at the end of this webinar. There'll be a QR code, and then we'll also send a link out to you to encourage you to fill out that short evaluation. Very short answers. You basically be clicking options, so it's very quick. It takes just a couple minutes to fill out. We appreciate your feedback in advance. To give you a kind of a picture of where those materials are, you can advance the next slide there, Ian. This is what our homepage looks like when you go to that web link. Also, just Google Florida Land Steward and go to the UF IFAS page, and this is the home page. The recordings, links, and materials to all of our programs, all of our events, all of our webinars are at that link that's circled in red right there. So encourage you to take advantage of that. Right now we've got Ian's presentation up. We've also got a couple other extension publications that we've put out. One about thinning in general, and another one about marking your thinning and what are the advantages and disadvantages of that and things to consider in that regard. I believe that's the end of my introductory slides, Ian, so I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you. Ian, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate this opportunity to talk to everybody. I appreciate everybody that's on the webinar today. And I think probably being a field forester, a lot of my career and doing a lot of public assistance, I worked with Florida Forest Service before I came over to UF IFAS. I think this question here is probably one of the number one questions I get as a forester. Uh, is it time to thin, or do I need to thin? Something along those lines. And also, I find that it is one of the ones that fairly often people get wrong. They A lot of times the thing is that they miss that first thinning window. That's probably one of the biggest ones. Is folks just flat out miss their first thinning window. They let it go 20 or 22 years for some reason. They weren't thinking about it, and it's been overly dense for longer than you would like. And that has some implications that we'll talk about through here. And a lot of times it's phrased as a question of timing, but really with thinning, it's a question of stand development. It's how has the stand hit a development stage and a density that we need to take action. We need to do something. It's no longer within optimal range. And when we talk about thinning, thinning can be a huge variety of practices, and even sometimes I hear thinning misapplied, or the term thinning misapplied to things that aren't completely actually a thinning. They're really actually more a type of uneven aged management and a selection system, which we'll talk about that in a little bit. So for the next slide, to me, defining what thinning is probably the best way to determine how you go about determining optimal thinning timing and how much to thin and how often to thin over the life of a rotation. And particularly, of course, pine is king in Florida, so we're talking about pine here. But if you have some hardwood stands, or you're in an area where you're managing some hardwoods, we'll have some information on that, and we can have some discussion at the end. But thinnings, as we already kind of mentioned, is a silviculture practice. It's designed primarily to manage stand density, but through managing density, what you're doing is managing competition and light availability, and also to a degree nutrient availability as well. When there's too many trees in a stand, then they compete. And to a degree, that competition is a good thing, because if you have stands, trees that are competing, it pushes them to grow up, and it also gives them the shading that they would need to have what we call self-pruning. Pines a lot of times will self-prune, and that actually can increase your grade of tree later on. So if you have a really open, if you think of like an old field that has just seeded in naturally with loblolly, and you don't really have a very planned stocking in there, a lot of times you get these kind of what foresters will call wolfy trees. So if you don't have enough trees, you don't get good form sometimes. And so what you're doing is, at a certain point, that stand reaches a point where the trees are competing too much, they're self-pruning too much, and then you get into what we call the self-thinning phase of the stand. The stand will thin itself if you don't do it. You're at some point. That's not good. That means we're losing production, we're losing value in the stand, and a lot of times we're opening ourselves up to things like pine beetle outbreaks and things like that. So there's really, when you think about it from a thinning perspective, especially from a landowner side, there's really kind of two thinning classifications that are really important. There's pre-commercial thinning, which means that the stand is needing to be thinned and the trees are not of commercial size class. And that's expensive. You kind of want to avoid that if you can. But sometimes if you have a lot of stands seed in, I've dealt with stands of longleaf that were replanted that had sand pine or loblolly, and they had a lot of natural seed in, and they get about 8 years old or something, and and they're not commercially available, but man, we need to do something because the density is way too high, and then we have loblolly competing with the longleaf, which we're trying to get the longleaf reestablished, and that's when pre-commercial thinning is usually kind of helpful. And really, what that looks like, if you've never seen it in the field, is you typically get a crew with what looks like a really souped up weed eater, a brush cutter, or you may come in there with something like a mulching machine or a bush hog, a brown tree cutter, a heavy duty bush hog, and come in there and cut lanes in between some of the planting rows, just to thin those trees out. And usually the landowner winds up having to pay for that. Commercial thinning is really where the kind of the bread and butter is. That's when we have commercial products that the trees that we need to take out can be sold for. They can be sold for pulpwood, or sometimes chip and saw, or sometimes even saw logs, or even poles, depending on what kind of thinning you're doing. But at its core, thinning's a practice to reduce and manage that density. And the question of when to thin is a function of how quickly that stand enters that area where the density and the competition is too heavy. But it's also in more depth, and it's a core timber stand improvement practice. Yes, we're removing the density, but we want to be real selective about how we do that and which trees we remove, especially once the trees get to be commercial size. Because if we thin the wrong trees, that means later on, especially if we're going with an even age rotation, that stand's value is going to be decreased. So if we do our thinning wrong, sometimes we don't get the benefits. Usually you'll still get the improved growth and yield, but you want to make sure you remove dead, diseased, damaged trees, poor forms, things with forks and big sweeps. And I've seen some plantations before that you're sitting there kind of looking at them going, man, this looks rough. We get in there with a thinning and we can clean it up pretty good. And I've seen stands go from kind of 0 to 60 on stuff where, it looked real rough at that first thinning, but when it was done, it looked really good. The right trees were left. Management of crown cover and shade is which also improves stand conditions for wildlife and habitat as well. And sometimes the optimal amount density for wildlife or habitat objectives may not be the same as optimal for timber growth and yield. In which case, if you have a good discussion with your forester, you can a lot of times kind of split the difference, which is really good. So one of the things here is this stand, and I'm a little new to webinars, so a lot of times I have more interactive type presentations. We can't do that with this, but if you look at this and think, what's wrong with this stand? Most people will take one look at this, and this is an overstock stand. This was probably one of the highest density stands I ever went to, and the reason was I was getting called out for pest and disease problems, which was no surprise when I got out there. I think this stand, when I took a basal area measurement on this, I think it was somewhere north of 120 square feet to the acre, if I remember correctly, which is really overstocked. The other thing is, I'm not sure if our viewers can quite see my mouse, but if you follow that mouse pointer, we've got a couple of trees in here with some sincere form problems and maybe even a little fusiform rust going on. And that's not uncommon for a stand planted like this. But through thinning, we can open this up. You can also see there's nothing growing under here at all, and there's very little light. That means that this stand has entered crown closure, and those stands, now the trees are competing with each other, and they're going to be winners and losers. And what we want to do is take those winners and losers out before they become a source of pests and diseases, or they just die and then become not worth anything. Now, in silviculture, we have two different types of management, really, that we kind of separate management into. And today we're going to focus mostly on this even age side of the equation. Because in our southern pine management, that's typically what we do. We're dealing with trees that are very shade intolerant, things like longleaf, loblolly, slash, sand pine, and if you're in an area that's managing that, all of those don't really like shade, and they don't typically like a lot of competition. Some of them are more sensitive to competition than others. And typically what we do there is, we plant a stand and then we run it through a rotation. And so they're planted or they're regenerated. You can use natural regeneration, something like a shelter wood system or seed tree or something of that nature. There are plenty of natural regenerated, even-aged systems. We don't typically use them as much in the Southeast because we do well with our artificial regeneration where we plant, and then we have a lot of control over the genetics and such. But you typically have one age class. Sometimes you may have more than one, but never 3 or 4. There's very little diameter distribution. Most things stay kind of clustered around one size class, and it's a very uniform structure. It's your typical southern pine plantation. That diameter will make something that sort of approximates a bell-shaped curve, where most of your diameter classes fall in, 2 or 3 or 4 diameter classes, and then there's a few on either ends, but not many. Thinning in these systems, crown closure occurs at one time. So the stand will grow up, and the stand moves through these stages, stand development stages linearly. So when crown closure occurs, and we start to see the live crown ratio, which we'll discuss a little bit in a minute, decrease, that's an indication we need to do thinning. Self-thinning begins when the stand becomes overstocked. And I've had landowners ask me before, if we planted it at what was an appropriate stocking, why is it becoming overstocked? And the answer is, as the trees grow, the amount of trees that an acre can support of larger trees decreases. So that's where we'll talk about trees per acre here in a minute and measures of density. You can't always, you have to realize too that, 10, 20 acre tree, 20 inch class trees per acre is a lot different than 10 saplings per acre. And when the thinning is done, that prevents that self-thinning and the negative effects of competition, and also hopefully generates some revenue. And there'll usually be several thinnings in a rotation. You very seldom do you see much more than 3, but usually you'll get into that. Now, uneven age stands will have multiple age classes. They have a non-uniform structure. They have large diameter variation. It kind of approximates kind of a reverse J shape. Typically around here, what you see this kind of thing in is bottomland hardwood. So if you're around the Apalachicola basin or any of our large river basins, and you do have some bottomland hardwood management going on, you may see this kind of forest management. There's no real rotation age or final harvest. Instead, you have these periodic cycles of harvesting based on the stand structure. And sometimes you'll have to actually thin these stands, and that gets really blurry when you get into these kind of systems. At what point is it a thinning versus some other type of harvest? But thinning in these stands becomes a matter of reducing tree competition or removing undesirable trees. If you have something like Box elder was a big one where I did a lot of work in Louisiana and where I grew up. You get a lot of box elder in a stand, and they would really compete against what were more desirable trees like red oaks of various sorts and white oaks and um, cypress and a few other things that you were trying to have. So you might remove those, but you also may have trees with defects and various things. Again, your density is getting higher than you want it. And a lot of times the thinning can be incorporated into other harvests. So if you're doing one of these um, entry cycles and you're in one of these entry cycles, you can kind of do some thinning along with something like a regeneration type harvest where you're trying to get more seedlings to develop in there. So I've got a kind of a even aged pine stand example, just how we kind of typically what you see here. The stand is planted, and when it's planted, the initial stocking and the site quality will determine the growth and development of the stand. So how you plant the stand, and also to a degree how you manage it, whether you uh, and that's everything from the genetics you select to how dense you plant it, to also whether or not you're doing things like early stand release treatments or something for competition. If you have a lot of woody competition or something like that, that'll determine that trajectory of how that stand develops and how fast it moves. So a lot of times you'll see foresters that change their recommendations on how many trees to plant based on how good the site quality is. Um, and sometimes even because right now here in the Panhandle, we're experiencing a lot of depressed pulpwood markets. And so um, if you have stands that are getting into pulpwood stage early and with smaller volumes, that's pushing you more towards that pre-commercial thinning, where if you don't have a good robust pulpwood market in an area, you may have difficulty getting that first thinning even done, depending on the volumes and such. So the stands you'll typically see them, and this is fairly common across species. Longleaf's a little longer. Loblolly, of course, grows a little faster. But at about 10 to 15 years of age on average, the stand will starting to get into crown closure, and you'll start to see it enter that self thinning stage. If left unthinned, it will self thin, and that's undesirable for the reasons we've already discussed. When you have the first thinning, usually you'll have only pulpwood will come off of that. You may have a few chip and saw or some upgrade trees, but hopefully you're only taking out the trees that are the lower value. So that's typically pulpwood, and you're leaving your best trees as your growing stock. And a lot of times the reduction is going to be somewhere between 20 to 40%. And a lot of times these are based on row thinnings. We'll talk about that a little bit in the coming slides. The stands left to grow until stocking reaches the upper limit again. There's actually this thing they call the self-thinning curve or the self-thinning line. There's various ways to calculate it, and there's lots of publications out there. Foresters typically use it, and there's standing stocking tables that a forester can use, and landowners too, if you're interested in learning how they work. You can kind of take some basic measurements and figure out where that stand is on that trajectory and how well stocked it is. And once you've done your first thinning, you then thin it down to a desirable level, and it grows again until it gets up to that upper stocking level, and then you reduce the stocking again, and then once it creeps back up. And what that does is that redirects growth towards the trees that are the best, and it improves the growth and yield and quality of the stand. And when you get into second thinnings or maybe even a third thinning, you're going to start to consider tree size. You get a lot more chip and saw and higher value products. And the goals are the ideal stocking and the best stand quality. You want to really start to, once you've done your first thinning and you've set it on that trajectory, you want to really start to look at thinning for quality. And then the stands pretty much left to grow until an optimal rotation age is reached in an even aged system. And then when that final rotation rolls around, harvest is reached, and you start the cycle over again. So this is something that typically most landowners will, maybe if you're lucky, you'll have 1 or 2 rotations of timber in your lifetime. You figure our average rotation is somewhere between 40 to 60 years. You're looking somewhere around 1 or 2 rotations if you're lucky. So thinning's actually the practice you're probably going to be more involved in over the life of your stand than the final harvest. Timing is a critical thing in thinning. That's probably one of the 2 biggest mistakes that you'll make with a thinning is not timing it correctly and not getting the density right. So thinning it too early is just as bad as thinning it too late. They cause different things, but thinning too much or thinning too little. And it really boils down to what is the stand conditions. The when or the timing to thin is directly tied to that stand development trajectory. So if you planted a stand at 700, real heavy stocking, you planted it at 700 and something trees to the acre, and a real tight stocking or spacing, or maybe even higher than that. Maybe you put it on an 8x8 and really pump that volume up there, which the first picture I showed was planted on a real tight spacing. That stand's going to hit that self-thinning stage, and it's going to need thinning earlier. And if it needs thinning early enough, you're in that pre-commercial zone. And again, that costs money. So we want to try to avoid that. And that also is going to depend on the site quality. Higher sites with higher quality sites with more nutrients and better growing conditions, the stand is going to move through that trajectory faster. You're going to be closer to that 10-year mark. If you have really good quality genetics, you really sprung for that good quality tree when you did your initial planting. Again, those are going to be able to, because of their genetic improvement, they're going to be able to take more advantage of the site. And so that how quick that timing is driven more on the number of trees and how big they are, and how big they are is a function of how well they can exploit the site. And the reason crown or canopy closure is so important is once that is has happened, the site has been completely captured, so to speak, by the trees, and they hopefully have the best and developed crown out there. And what's going to happen is, as they keep going, those crowns are going to start to die back, and you're going to start to get winners and losers. The density is how many trees are on the site, just a pure number of trees. But density also has a size and volume component. As I mentioned, 10 20-inch trees is way different than 10 4-inch trees. And the same is true, whether you're whatever tree species you're dealing with, size is a big consideration. And then you have commercial considerations. Sort of, is the stand merchantable? Has it crossed that threshold where we have, on average, pulpwood sized trees, something that can be hauled to a mill and we can get some revenue off? What's the desirable revenue? From a optimal silviculture standpoint, it may be time to thin, but from an optimal revenue generation, we may have wanted to thin a little early, or we may want to push that off a little bit. Maybe markets are really bad right at that moment. We had a recent hurricane. Maybe we were lucky we were outside of that hurricane swath, but the mills are full and flush of wood, and the wood price is real low, and we want to kind of push that thinning off a little bit. You've got a window, so you want to work within that window, but you also want to you also don't want to put a thinning off trying to hope to get a better market, and then you lose the value of the thinning. I've seen that happen a lot. I want to push my thinning off because pulpwood markets aren't good. Well, we don't know how long the pulpwood market may stay bad. It may stay bad 5 or 6 years, and at that point, we're just losing volume. So if we can get a thinning done and generate a little revenue, that's still a win. Is there enough volume to attract a sale? That's a big one nowadays, especially with logging systems that we have now. Are we experiencing disease or tree quality issues? If we've got a lot of disease, or for some reason maybe we didn't spring for that good genetic quality, and we look around and we got a lot of fusiform rust, and we got a lot of forks and all kinds of problems, then maybe we want to push that thinning up further in that window. But what we don't want to do is thin outside our optimal window. And common issues, I've mentioned a few of these. Thinning too early, what happens then is a lot of times you're giving up probably some revenue that you could have had. The trees may not be merchantable yet, or they may not be as much volume as you could have had if you'd put it off a little bit. Thinning too late, what happens then is you're losing that potential. And if you wait long enough, sometimes you can completely lose a thinning response. It's hard to do that, but if you have enough of your trees that go below the live crown ratio, slash in particular is bad about that. It will stunt once it gets to a certain point where it's lost enough of its living crown. They'll just kind of hang there, and you'll see that where you don't really get the thinning response. But if you had thinned it, you'll get it. Lack of pre-planning is another big one. You want to pre-plan this where you know that you've got loggers that are going to be coming out. Everybody knows what to thin. We'll talk some about that. We don't want to know how much to thin, when, what we're targeting, whether or not we're going to market or do an operator select. All of that kind of stuff needs to be pre-planned, and hopefully you're monitoring your stand periodically to where well, has my stand gotten into overstocked or not? Or, okay, it's at this stocking level, and so in about 5 or 6 years, it probably ought to be thinned. It'll probably be about right. Again, on the pre-commercial thinning, that's where that pre-planning comes in. You want to match it to the site. If you plant way too many trees, or somehow you get a lot of natural regeneration, you wind up really overstocked. That's going to really force that pre-commercial thinning, which if you need to pre-commercial thin, it's a good practice to do, because the situation is not going to get any better, and you're going to continually have problems, and you're going to lose yield. But you want to avoid that if at all possible, because it winds up costing money when it could have been avoided. Without a plan or cruising information to guide thinning, you really have trouble making these determinations and on is it time to thin or not. And another common issue is breaking stands up into too small a unit, and that can happen at planting. A lot of cost share programs and stuff, you can go to quite small acreages, and if that's the only thing you're going to have to thin on your property in years from now, on average, usually if you're getting much below 40 or 50 acres, it's real hard to get a crew to come in for anything, especially a thinning. So if you have some other stands, you want to kind of be looking at your stands across your ownership, so that if you have some other stands that you're going to be doing a harvest on, maybe you can throw that first thinning in there on that smaller block. That a lot of times needs to be really analyzed and pre-planned. Now, density is how we answer that question of how much. That's the other big one. When and how much are the two big questions in thinning. And the answer is, we got to know our stocking. With stand density and stocking, for each stand, there's somewhat of an optimal stocking rate for growing timber and for other objectives. Your objective should drive your determination of what your optimal stocking is. If you're really focused on having a open, grassy, longleaf stand with optimal quail habitat and things like that, and you're going to be doing a lot of prescribed burning and that sort of thing, you may have an optimal stocking that's lower than what maximizes growth and yield per acre. My experience is most landowners have multiple objectives, and so we get into that sustainable, multiple objective, sustainable yield type model that we all talk about in forestry. And when you have multiple objectives and you're looking at how much yield you want, optimal timber stocking is focused on maximum growth. And then from there, you can say, okay, well, this would be my optimal stocking for growth. And then this is my optimal stocking for maybe, some wildlife needs or other things. Maybe it's purely aesthetic. Maybe, most of us actually, if you poll people, they typically like lower stocking levels. And one thing that they've done a lot of studies of across the United States, we actually have a lot more trees on our landscape than we have according to past records and information that we can glean from things like the Timber Inventory and Analysis Program with UF Forest Service. And so a lot of stands really kind of need to be thinned. What's really good is when you can kind of split the difference, where you can say, okay, well, here's my optimal for timber and here's my optimal for wildlife, and I'm going to kind of find a place that's a happy medium. When you're dealing with stocking, the biggest density factor is a measurement of how you measure that stocking. And the way you measure density, you have trees per acre, which just simply how many trees are there per acre. It doesn't take into account size. You have basal area, which the simplest way to explain basal area is the cross-sectional area of how much cross-section of tree is there per acre. If you think about, you take the tree cookie and turn it sideways and then think about that stacked across the acre, it does a pretty good amount of measuring that. And then you have standing volume, which is usually cords per acre, cubic feet per acre, board foot per acre, or tons per acre, which is actually a weight volume, but that's how most timber is bought and sold now. You want to look at your current densities and volumes. You want to look for the desired density and objective, and then you want to have the desired thinning reduction to reach your objectives. And the way you do that is you look at some methods, and we're going to talk about some methods and designs of how you can go about accomplishing that. You figure out your density, you know it's time to thin, you know kind of what density you want to hit. There's multiple ways to go after that trajectory. the biggest thing with thinning or with any forest management is crown structure. The crown of the tree, the living live crown of the tree, is where it's photosynthesizing. It's where it's getting the nutrients that it needs. And if that live crown goes below a certain percentage, or you have poor quality crowns, that's when you start to have trouble. That's why the growth will decline. It's a function of competition. And so what live crown ratio does, it relates the length of the live crown to the total tree height. So if you have a 40-foot tall tree and 20 feet of it has living crown and needles and such on it, or leaves, then that would be a 50% live crown ratio. Below 40%, when you start getting into the 40 and 30% range, that really indicates that you've got an overstock stand and that you need to probably start to thin. Crown position is you have the dominants, which are the big, tall trees that have the largest crowns, and they dominate the site. They dominate over all the other trees. Then you have the codominants, which get up into the same crown position, but not quite. And the dominants and codominants are usually what you really want to have. Those are your trees that are doing the best. Then you have intermediate, which is one crown position below that. And then the suppressed trees, or if you go into a stand that has pretty heavy stocking or might be uneven aged, you'll see whips, we call them a lot of times in pine management, or just suppressed crowns that are lower down, they don't get as much light. Some trees, if you release the intermediates and suppress, they will go ahead and grow. Things like oaks. Oaks can handle being down in that suppressed position for a while. Sometimes you can do a release treatment. Some trees like pines, they don't really, once they get stuck into that suppressed and they get low enough, they just they'll hang out, and sometimes if you release them, they'll do okay and they'll really put on some volume. But by and large, you're managing mostly the dominants and codominants in pines. So what you want is good, healthy dominants of good size and good vigor with crowns of at least probably 40% live crown or better. There is such a thing as too much live crown ratio. That's where you get too wide a spacing, you wind up with a lot of limbs lower down, and that can cause a bit of a problem. So 40% tends to be around that magic happy point. Thinning can be done as I mentioned, to release those, but that's more common in those hardwood stands than pines. Now, thinning methods that we can use, we have row or geometric thinnings. That's where tree removal, some people call this mechanical thinning, but that gets kind of blurry, I find, when you talk with a large group of people with diverse backgrounds. They think mechanical thinning means pre-commercial thinning. So row or geometric thinning thins the trees by their sheer position of where they are in the landscape. So like you hear somebody say, oh, well, it needs to be thinned, and I'm recommending a 5th row thinning. That's a row or a geometric thinning. Let's thin 5th row every 6th tree. And those are handy, but they don't always look at quality or crown position. Thinning by crown position is where you look at the crown position and the tree size to determine what you're going to thin out. That thinning from below is probably one of the most common crown position thinnings used in pine silviculture, particularly with longleaf and slash and the trees that we have in Florida. You go out and you target suppressed and intermediate crowns to remove them from the stand so that they're not competing with the dominant trees. Crown thinning or thinning from above, that low thinning or thinning from below, you're targeting those. Well, when you're targeting the using the thinning from above method, you remove some dominant or primarily codominant trees to favor the best trees. And that can also be used as a release treatment for some of the lower crowns if you have that structure. Selection thinnings use crown position and removes larger trees to favor those in the lower crown position. So this is really when you're starting to do that release treatment of trying to release trees of good form that have gotten into that intermediate level. Free thinning or crop tree release is that combines multiple criteria, but the primary thing there is you're designating crop trees. All right, that tree clearly is going to make a nice pole one day, but it's got this other tree, maybe a dominant tree that's competing with it that's lesser quality. So I'm going to thin those trees based on their crown position and how desirable they are for the future stand. You do have to be a little careful with that. You want to have a good forester and people that you're working with that you trust, because if this isn't done properly and the proper crop trees aren't selected, you can high grade the stand, is often what it's called. It means you've taken out the best quality trees and left trees that are of lower quality, and that kind of goes in the opposite direction of the way thinning is really designed to work. Now, forest health improvements, you have a reduction in disease risk such as SPB. That's why some of the cost share programs like Southern Pine Beetle Program, first thinning is a practice that's under that cost share, is because you do a first thinning, time it right, you especially in loblolly, but also slash and longleaf, but primarily in loblolly, you can really reduce. That's a very good practice for reducing southern pine beetle risk. Overstocked young longleaf stands are some of the first ones loblolly stands are some of the first ones to get hit by that. You can remove diseased trees such as this one here. This has a very bad fusiform rust gall, and that's permanent. Once that tree has developed that gall, you're not going to get rid of that unless you remove it from the stand. So you can really take care of some of those issues. You reduce fire damage risk, especially in a younger stand. That first thinning can really reduce the potential that you'll have a catastrophic loss in the event that a fire creeps in there. You can correct stand damage from such as broken tops and things. So if you've had a wind event or an ice storm or something that's come through and it's caused a lot of damage, a thinning is a great time to get some of those damaged trees out. Same with lower value and those sorts of things. Here's a couple of cautions: is thinning can increase the chance of wind throw. A lot of times after a hurricane, if you had recently thinned stands or the stands that are at some of the lower density, especially stands that recently went through their second thinning, a lot of times those are the ones that get hit really hard. And how much you thin can influence how big that risk is. So you do want to keep that in mind. Thinning can also increase competing vegetation. You're not just releasing the trees, you're increasing light on the ground too. So if you already have a really bad yaupon or other problem vegetatively, the logging equipment will kind of mash that down and take care of it a little bit. But if you don't do something, that can really come back with a vengeance. So you want to monitor that closely. Thinning and fire. Overstock stands are difficult to burn, and so they can pose a significant risk. When you get into loblolly and slash, a lot of times you see that fire isn't really introduced until after first thinning, and that's a common practice, and it's not a bad practice. It doesn't have to be that way. But the reason for that is they're a lot more vulnerable to fire, and they typically have bigger crowns than longleaf, and so that is a common practice there. Thin stands have a more open canopy, so that really reduces the risk of crown scorch. Your wind movement and flow is increased, so you tend to get a little better fire behavior. And immediately after your thinning, your fuel loads can be high, so use caution. You just had that, you got a lot of logging slash out there, and prescribed fire can control competition and improve thinning response. So I mentioned you can get that vegetative response from thinning. So putting prescribed fire in once you start to get your thinning regimes going, that's a really good practice. For setting targets, you've got basal area is often the best measure for a stand, um, because it factors in tree size as well as the number of trees. It relates both of those. Trees per acre fails to account for size and also crown positions. So if you're strictly looking at trees per acre and trees per acre targets, you're missing some of those other components. Not that trees per acre is necessarily a bad measurement, but if you wonder why basal area tends to be used as a target, it's because it kind of incorporates all of those. It doesn't directly measure volume, but you can sort of infer the volume from basal area, so you can get an idea. Really, when you're looking at it, it's a kind of a simple equation. Current density minus desired density gives you your removal target. You want to consider outcomes such as timber growth and quality, and the wildlife habitat. You may want lower density for your habitat considerations for higher density, but higher for timber. So it really becomes a question of what's optimal, and your objectives should drive your decisions, which the decision you make will determine the thinning outcome. So all that to say, have a good solid talk with your forester. If you don't have a forester, I strongly encourage you to use one when you're doing thinnings and making these decisions. One thing to remember, and I tell this all the time as a forester, is I'm almost like an engineer. If you tell me I need to pass a certain amount of water through a crossing, I look at it and say, okay, I can pass that with this setup with culverts, and it'll go. It's the same way a little bit with things like this. If you tell a forester, I want maximum timber yield, and don't give them any consideration for wildlife, that's the only information they have, they're going to come up with a thinning target to maximize timber yield, and they're not going to look too much at wildlife. So the better discussions and everything you have, the better decisions you'll make as a management team. We have mark versus operator select. You hear this question come up a lot. Marking by a forester is often an outcome, and often results in the best outcome, because the foresters out there, they can see what trees need to be removed. It is an added cost, and it can be very significant on first thinning, because a lot of times you got to mark a lot of trees. You got to, especially if you're having to do a row thinning, you got to mark all the trees in the row that's going to take out. Then you got to mark the trees in the ones that are going to be left. Some stand conditions can make mark sales difficult. If it's woolly as heck and the forester's having trouble to go through there, that can really make a difference. You have to mark it, you have to know what equipment's going to come in. You have to mark that accordingly. But when you get onto your second thinnings and selection thinnings and those sorts of things, it becomes pretty important. I would say that's, you can debate about whether to mark the first thinning or not, but past that, marking is probably the best option. But operator select, many loggers are very skilled and they are very capable of making good decisions, especially on third thinnings. First thinnings. The first thinning, a lot of times people will use the operator select. Contractors free to select and harvest trees as needed for clearance and to accomplish it. So if you're not sure what equipment they're bringing, then sometimes that works out a little better. It really boils down to how comfortable is the landowner with the contractor that's doing the work, and vice versa. If you've got to make that, poorly marked sales can make it difficult for a contractor. And if a contractor comes out and they don't like how it's marked and stuff, they may tell you, hey, I can't harvest that the way it is, or they may just not give you a bid. And a lot of times that's what happens. So you have a lot of considerations there. We got some operational considerations. This is big. What equipment's available? This is old three-wheeled harvester that you don't really see those anymore, but it was perfect for first thinnings. So now we typically have bigger equipment. We tend to have bigger skidders and bigger feller bunchers, and that can create some issues sometimes with how we're doing the thinning and how they're laid out. Pulpwood tends to drive the first thinning market. So, what are the market conditions and how is that going to play out? You want to look at how important is revenue. The longer term benefits from thinning are much higher than intermediate revenue generated. So, if you fail to do a first thinning or you really put it off because of revenue considerations, then sometimes you're really losing out on the back end, and you never really quite see that. You kind of lose it, and you won't really notice it unless you see what's could have been, which is hard to visualize a lot of times. You've got to have enough volume to attract a sale. If you can't generate that from the thinning, then maybe if you have the ability to combine it with other sales, that's a good practice. And then high grading can be a significant issue. So my tip there is use good professionals. Once a stand's high graded, which means that basically somebody targeted for some reason, or somehow maybe it was a miscommunication or something, but the good crop trees have been removed, that can't really be undone. You're kind of stuck with that at that point. So you want to make sure that that doesn't happen, and now we have it open for discussion and questions. I don't see any questions on the webinar yet, but feel free to throw some in there.
All right. Thank you, Ian. That was fantastic. Great overview of thinning and all the various considerations that go into it. Yeah, go ahead and ask some questions. Use that Q&A function if you've got any questions or discussions or feedback or comments or other perspectives to share. We've got a few minutes left in the webinar here, so feel free to use this time for discussion. Ian, if you want to go ahead and advance to the next slide, I'll go through some of our concluding slides while folks are browsing the Q&A function if they've got questions. I want to encourage everyone one more time, if you want to have access to the materials that accompany this webinar, those are available on our website, Florida Land Steward. It's the UF-IFAS Florida Land Steward site. And if you go to that recordings, links, and materials on our homepage, that's where you can find those materials. And as I said before, we've got Ian's presentation, the PDF document of his presentation, as well as our publications. One's entitled Thinning Southern Pines, A Key to Greater Returns, and Marking First Thinnings in Pine Plantations, Potential for Increased Economic Returns. Those are the publications we've got available on the site. Looks like we might have a question here.
Yep, I see that.
Okay.
And it's from Lee, and for the good of the group, I'll read it out. It's a very good question. It says SPB Assistant Program requires a 720 tree per acre planting. Seems like overkill to me and leads to some of these thinning issues. Should the Department of Forestry change their requirements? I see the point on that. And I definitely think it's probably a valid discussion to have with Florida Forest Service and the Department of Forestry, for the SPB program. Chris, do you know if they have the SP? Is that specific to our state only, or is there some?
Well, I'm not sure if that's a Florida only program. The funding comes from the U.S. Forest Service, so other states might get funding for that program. I'm not familiar with that particular requirement on that program, so that's news to me. I'm not sure if that's a Florida question specifically, or perhaps Alabama or another state where that requirement might be. That's going to be. I'm gonna ask about that. That's a really good question. Lee, do
Yeah.
you know if that's are you asking from Alabama perspective or Florida? He's Florida. Okay.
Florida. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I'll
Um,
look into that and see.
well, and I do think that particularly it depends on the part of Florida you're in. If you're in the Jacksonville area where there's a very robust pulp market, um, 720 trees to the acre, depending on the quality of site and um, the trees that are being planted, whether they're slash versus loblolly. And I'm not sure, but if I remember correctly, um, Southern pine beetle will pay for longleaf or slash. I don't think it pays for loblolly. Um, you have to go under another. So for me, from my perspective, 720 trees to the acre, particularly on longleaf, is definitely within a range. Longleaf is a little bit different than slash or loblolly. That would be, I think, rather high. Although for a long time that was a very common recommendation, was about 720 trees to the acre. Um, but our older forestry models, we had very robust pulpwood markets all across the southeast. So the pulpwood market kind of guided a lot of recommendations, and um, I think it's definitely something to take a look at. But it very much does. I would hope that for these kind of cost share programs, I know it's very difficult for the agencies to make those kind of determinations, but those type of things really, really do vary by site and what's being planted and how. If you're planting bare root slash, that's not got a whole lot of improved genetic quality to it, 720 trees per acre is a lot more reasonable a recommendation than planting something like containerized high growth slash. As I mentioned, that's really going to change that. But I think it's definitely something that probably Florida Forest Service may want to sit down and take a look at. Is you know how does this match up with our landowner needs that are signing up for this program? Because if you plant too thick on the wrong site early, and you have to go in there and pre-commercial thin, uh, not only did you have to pay for the pre-commercial thinning crew, you paid for trees you didn't really need up front, and that has an economic impact over the rotation of the stand that is kind of undesirable.
Yeah, I'm going to ask about that. Thanks for bringing that up, Lee. Any other questions? All right, if you want to go ahead and advance the next slide, Ian. I
Okay.
think this brings us to our evaluation QR code, perhaps.
There we go.
There it is. Yeah, there's the QR code for the evaluation for this webinar. If you can, if you want to go ahead and scan that on your phone. If not, I'm going to send out the link probably directly after this webinar, and you can fill it out there. But that's there for you to take advantage of if you'd like. If you're got your cell phone handy and don't mind using the QR code, that would be good. You can keep that up for a couple minutes there. You can go ahead and advance it now, Ian.
All right.
Want to thank all of our partners, our program partners that support our efforts. The Florida Forest Service, of course, is a big one. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, USDA agencies like the NRCS and the FSA, the U.S. Forest Service, where a lot of this funding comes from for cost share programs that the Forest Service administers, as well as the funding for our outreach program. The Florida Forestry Association is a great partner. That's really our connection to the industry. Their annual meeting is coming up this coming week, starting on August 27th. I will be there, and hopefully I'll see some of you there as well. The Florida Tree Farm program is an amazing partner and does a lot of great work to get landowners certified in their program. And of course, that's related to the Sustainable Forestry Initiative Implementation Committee in Florida, which is also a supporter of our efforts. So I want to recognize all these great partners we have, in addition to the University of Florida IFAS Cooperative Extension Force Service that, are folks like Ian that are out there, extension agents that are out there reaching landowners. They're a really important partner out in the counties and really help us to organize extension events, landowner tours, workshops, and even webinars like this. So really appreciate the network we have in Florida, all these partners working together for landowners. Ian, you can put up that last slide, and that's our concluding slide. That also has our evaluation code. So if you want one more chance to scan that and do that evaluation, that would be great. Ian, thanks so much again for providing this presentation today. That was really informative, and I even learned a few things myself. So you brought some good, interesting perspectives to this topic. Really appreciate that.
I appreciate the opportunity to do that. That's anytime we get to partner up on things, and I think these webinars are great for folks, especially in the summer. Nobody quite wants to be outside in the heat, so I appreciate the opportunity.
It's the heat or thunderstorms, one of the two right now.
Yeah. Yep.
All right, great. Thank you very much for that feedback, folks that are signing out. We appreciate you participating. And once again, I'll be sending out that evaluation link, and it'll be up there. We'll keep that up there for another minute so you can scan it. And until the next time, until we meet again, either online or out in the field, or at a workshop out in the counties, or at the Forestry Association meeting coming up, we bid you a good afternoon. We'll see you later.